Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift through a story of promise and quiet power, the rise and fall of nuclear energy in America. A story that begins with light, the pure, invisible light released from the heart of an atom. For decades, humanity had looked to the stars for energy. But in the middle of the 20th century, we discovered that the stars were already inside us, tiny suns burning in every atom of the world around us. In that discovery, people saw the future, cities glowing without smoke, oceans lit by endless current, and a world freed from the limits of coal and oil. So tonight, as you lie back and let your thoughts soften, we'll drift through that hopeful beginning and through the long, quiet decades that followed. We'll hear the hum of reactors, the silence of abandoned projects, and the faint glow of renewal that still lingers today. A lullaby powered by the atom itself. Our story begins in the 1940s, at the edge of war and wonder. In laboratories across the United States, scientists unlocked a force beyond imagination, the splitting of the atom. It began as destruction, a new kind of fire unleashed upon the world. But even in those first uneasy years, some saw something else inside that fire. Not death, but light. President Eisenhower spoke of atoms for peace, a dream to turn weapons into warmth, to use the same invisible reactions to power homes instead of bombs. Engineers began sketching blueprints for reactors that could hum quietly for decades, using only small amounts of uranium to produce vast amounts of energy. No soot, no smoke, just the steady hiss of steam and the whisper of turbines in motion. To many, nuclear power felt like magic that had been tamed. Newspapers called it the dawn of a new age. Children were told they might one day have atomic-powered cars or even kitchens that glowed with safe, clean energy. America believed it stood on the threshold of limitless light. By the early 1960s, the atomic age was no longer a dream. It was an industry. Across the American landscape, new reactors began to rise like gentle monuments of progress. Cooling towers curved toward the sky, their white steam clouds drifting like quiet ghosts above green hills and riverbanks. Each plant promised the same thing: abundant energy, born not from fire, but from the careful splitting of atoms inside a sealed chamber of steel. Engineers worked with the precision of clockmakers. Inside the reactor vessel, fuel rods shimmered underwater, glowing with a soft blue light. Cherenkov radiation, a beautiful reminder that even the smallest particles of nature could shine. Outside, control rooms filled with blinking lights and analog dials hummed in a steady rhythm like a mechanical heartbeat. It was an era of boundless optimism. Politicians spoke of electricity that would be, as one phrase famously claimed, too cheap to meter. Nuclear power, they said, would light every home, drive every industry, and free the world from the smoke of coal and the uncertainty of oil. America's cities glowed brighter than ever, and few doubted that the atom would guide them into a cleaner, endless tomorrow. Yet, even in this glowing optimism, quiet doubts began to stir. The promise of atomic perfection required delicate balance, safety, precision, and trust. The technology was young, and its margins for error were narrow. A single miscalculation could ripple through miles of circuitry, through valves and cooling systems, until the hum of energy became the hum of warning. Still, the vision pressed forward. Between 1960 and 1975, more than 100 reactors were planned, many near rivers or coastlines where water could cool their cores. Entire towns grew around these plants. Workers moved in, schools were built, grocery stores opened. A new kind of American life took shape, one built on quiet confidence in the hum of the reactor. But behind the control panels, small questions began to accumulate like dust. What if a valve failed? What if power was lost? Could the human mind, however careful, truly master the atom forever? The lights of the atomic age still shone bright, but faint shadows had begun to stretch at their edges. By the 1970s, the glow of the atomic age began to flicker. The dream had grown expensive. Each new plant cost more to design, more to build, more to secure. Regulations expanded, safety standards tightened, and what was once a symbol of effortless progress now demanded constant vigilance. The oil crisis of 1973 gave nuclear power a brief resurgence of hope. As gasoline lines stretched for miles, many looked again toward the silent hum of uranium as a path to energy independence. Engineers redoubled their efforts. Utility companies filed new plans. Yet something had changed. The public's faith had softened. Where once nuclear energy had been seen as the light of the future, now it was often seen as a question mark glowing faintly in the dark. Environmental movements were rising, and voices across the country began to ask, what happens to the waste? How long will it remain dangerous? Can we truly control something born from the heart of the atom? In March of 1979, those quiet doubts became a storm. At 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, a cooling malfunction spiraled into the most serious accident in American nuclear history. Alarms rang, valves jammed, operators worked through the night in confusion and fear. Although the reactor's containment held and the radiation release was limited, the event captured the nation's imagination and its unease. Television screens filled with images of the plant's twin towers shrouded in mist. News anchors spoke of invisible danger. The public, once comforted by the hum of reactors, now listened for it with dread. Construction halted across the country. Dozens of planned reactors were quietly canceled. Nuclear energy, once promised as safe, clean, and limitless, now carried an invisible weight. Investors withdrew. Politicians hesitated. And for the first time, the American atomic dream felt fragile, like glass under strain. The 1980s arrived with a quieter tone. America still had dozens of reactors under construction, but the momentum had slowed. Budgets stretched thin, lawsuits multiplied, and timelines slipped by the year. For many communities, the plants that once symbolized progress now sat half-finished, great concrete shells filled with silence instead of steam. In 1986, a distant echo arrived from across the ocean. News broke of a reactor explosion in Chernobyl, deep in the Soviet Union. The world watched the gray plumes rise above the Ukrainian countryside, and though it happened far away, its shadow reached everywhere. Suddenly, the word nuclear felt heavier. It was no longer only about science or promise, it was about trust. Parents worried, protest signs multiplied, and governments everywhere revisited their plans. Even as American reactors continued to run safely, their image dimmed beneath the long shadow of that distant fire. At the turn of the 21st century, something subtle began to shift. The air felt heavier, the seasons a little less predictable. Summers stretched longer, storms arrived sooner, and even the quiet hum of modern life began to carry an undertone of unease. The great promise of endless progress had revealed its cost, the warmth of the planet itself. In the distance, coal plants still burned like man-made suns, gas turbines whirred across plains, and oil rigs stood like skeletons on the horizon. The world's appetite for power was insatiable, but the atmosphere was changing. For the first time in decades, people began to speak not of more energy, but of cleaner energy, of wind and water, of sunlight, and perhaps of the atom once again. After years in the shadows, nuclear power quietly re-entered the conversation. The old engineers, many of them gray-haired and long-retired, watched with cautious pride as the technology they once defended was rediscovered by a new generation. They called it the nuclear renaissance. Articles appeared in science journals and policy papers, filled with new language, Generation 4 reactors, passive cooling systems, modular cores, designs that promised to be smaller, safer, and smarter than the giants of the 20th century. In university classrooms, students studied diagrams of thorium cycles and pebble-bed reactors. They no longer imagined mushroom clouds, but glowing blue light underwater. Cherenkov radiation, that ghostly hue born from electrons moving faster than light, can travel through liquid. It wasn't a symbol of danger to them. It was beauty. It was possibility. Governments, too, began to reconsider the atom. With coal declining and gas prices volatile, the promise of carbon-free electricity held new weight. Nuclear plants already produced energy without smoke or soot, their output steady through calm nights and stormy days alike. Where wind could fade and sunlight could vanish, a reactor could run for months on a handful of fuel rods. It was elegant in its endurance, quiet, consistent, and immense. And so, policy by policy, meeting by meeting, the conversation shifted. What had once been seen as an outdated relic of the Cold War began to feel again like an unfinished chapter. a tool left waiting in the corner of human progress. In Idaho and Tennessee, new projects were proposed. In Georgia, workers returned to half-completed sites. Scientists spoke in hopeful tones, not of conquering nature, but of restoring balance with it. For a moment, it seemed that the story of nuclear power, thought to be ending, might simply be turning the page. The atom was back in the light, no longer feared, but approached with quiet respect. After half a century of turbulence, America stood once again before its old companion, listening for that familiar hum, soft, steady, and full of unrealized promise. But optimism, no matter how bright, has always walked beside uncertainty. Even as America rediscovered its quiet faith in the atom, history lingered like a soft shadow. Every new reactor design carried the memory of unfinished projects and faded confidence. Still, the movement gathered momentum. Engineers spoke gently of progress this time, measured not in ambition, but in restraint, smaller, safer, steadier. The nuclear renaissance was young, but its roots were hopeful. Then, one morning in March 2011, the world shifted. An earthquake struck off Japan's northeastern coast, one of the most powerful ever recorded. Within minutes, a tsunami rose from the sea and rushed inland, carrying with it homes, cars, and lives. In its path stood the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. As the wall of water struck, generators meant to cool the reactor cores were drowned. Pumps failed. Pressure climbed. Over the next days, the world watched as workers fought to contain what nature had undone. A quiet battle against invisible heat. Helicopters hovered, seawater was dropped, and through plumes of white steam, an old fear reawakened. Across the Pacific, Americans watched in stillness. News anchors spoke softly, the way people do when they sense the world is holding its breath. The familiar imagery returned. Evacuation maps, radiation readings, faces behind masks. It was not their tragedy, yet the echo of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl stirred again in the collective memory. Within weeks, plans were paused. Governments reviewed safety standards, investors hesitated. In some states, new projects were shelved entirely. The bright promise of a nuclear revival dimmed beneath the shadow of uncertainty once more. It wasn't rejection, not quite, more like exhaustion. A sense that every leap forward was met with the same invisible resistance. Yet beneath the noise, the reactors across America continued their quiet work. In deserts and forests, by rivers and lakes, they kept generating light without smoke or flame. Engineers showed up for their shifts as they always had, logging temperatures, checking gauges, listening to the low vibration of turbines turning night into day. In the silence that followed Fukushima's wave, the atom did not vanish. It simply grew humbler. It was no longer the symbol of unstoppable progress or national pride. It was something quieter now, almost contemplative. A reminder of humanity's constant search for balance between power and peace. ambition, and humility. And though the headlines faded, the reactors remained, steadfast, humming, invisible, their glow still reaching into the homes of millions who never knew, as they turned on a lamp before sleep, that their light had traveled from the heart of a controlled star. In the years that followed, the conversation around nuclear power softened, like embers still glowing after the flame had faded. The panic had subsided, replaced by something quieter, a long pause, a thoughtful reconsideration. The public was tired of fear. Scientists, too, were tired of defending. What remained was a simple question. Could nuclear energy still matter? Not as a miracle or a menace, but as a humble part of a larger balance. Through the 2010s, while headlines turned to solar fields gleaming in the desert and wind farms spinning off the coasts, America's reactors continued their steady work in the background. They produce light without celebration, their cooling towers exhaling faint clouds that drifted like breath into the morning air. In control rooms across the country, engineers kept the same rituals: daily checks, slow rotations of dials, logs written in careful pen strokes. The sound inside those buildings was always the same: the quiet hum of machinery, the rhythmic pulse of pumps, the low murmur of a system designed to run continuously for decades. There was a comfort in that consistency, a reassurance that even as technology shifted around them, the core principles remained unchanged. Each reactor was a quiet star, burning invisibly within its vessel. Deep inside, neutrons collided with uranium atoms, splitting them apart, releasing heat, and sustaining a chain reaction that could last for years on a few hundred rods of fuel. That heat became steam. The steam turned turbines, and turbines made light. A process so elegant it almost felt alive. And in a sense, it was alive, tended by human hands, governed by physics, balanced by patience. The people who worked in those facilities often described them with affection. They spoke of the faint vibrations that could be felt through the floor, the gentle warmth that filled the air, the sense of quiet responsibility that came from overseeing something so powerful, yet so fragile. Despite decades of debate, nuclear energy had quietly become America's second-largest source of carbon-free electricity. It powered cities, factories, hospitals, and the endless digital infrastructure of the modern age. The servers that stored our photos, our memories, our voices, all fed in part by those invisible suns humming across the countryside. Outside the gates, though, the world had moved on. Wind and solar were faster to build, cheaper to finance, easier to explain. Yet they were fleeting, bound to the rhythm of day and weather, while the atom kept its steady pulse. It was a strange irony. The very consistency that had once been celebrated was now seen as old-fashioned. But nuclear energy never sought attention. Its gift was constancy. Its story had become a lesson in endurance, that sometimes progress doesn't march forward with noise and applause. Sometimes it hums softly in the dark, waiting for the world to notice again. By the early 2020s, a quiet transformation began to unfold. Not the grand industrial surge of the 1950s, but something smaller, humbler, and perhaps wiser. The world had changed. The language of progress now spoke of sustainability, of decarbonization, of balance, and within that new vocabulary, nuclear power found a gentler voice, no longer promising domination over nature, but harmony with it. Across the United States, a new generation of engineers, entrepreneurs, and physicists returned to the atom with fresh eyes. They were not haunted by the Cold War or the oil crisis. They had grown up in the shadow of climate change and saw energy not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. To them, nuclear power was not an outdated relic, but an unfinished symphony. They spoke of small modular reactors, compact systems that could be built in controlled environments, transported by rail, and installed where needed. These weren't the towering giants of the past, but measured, deliberate machines. Their designs relied on passive cooling rather than pumps, on natural convection rather than complex circuitry. If something went wrong, physics itself would bring them to rest. In laboratories from Oregon to Tennessee, prototypes began to hum. In Idaho, the first of these modern reactors neared construction. Others experimented with molten salts, liquid metal, or even recycled waste as fuel. Each idea aiming to rewrite a small piece of the nuclear story. The new generation didn't seek perfection. They sought resilience, power that could adapt, endure, and coexist. Meanwhile, deep within national labs, another dream flickered brighter. Fusion, the merging of atoms instead of their separation. A star's heartbeat contained within a magnetic field. Decades of failure had hardened expectations, yet hope persisted. Each new experiment seemed to last a little longer, hold a little steadier, burn a little brighter. In quiet halls surrounded by coils and cryogenics, researchers whispered of ignition, of the moment when fusion would finally produce more energy than it consumed. It was no longer science fiction. It was the slow breathing of the future, faint but steady, a reminder that light, like faith, can survive in the darkest chambers of patience. By the mid-2020s, America's nuclear fleet had become a living archive of its own. History, a mix of old and new, of endurance and experimentation. Many of the country's 9/3 operating reactors were approaching middle age. Some had been built in the 1970s, their concrete shells weathered by decades of heat and rain, their turbine blades polished by billions of revolutions. Yet, with careful maintenance and modern upgrades, these same plants still supplied roughly a fifth of the nation's electricity. More than all, its solar panels combined. Life extension programs became the new frontier. Engineers, replaced aging cables, reinforced containment vessels, and upgraded analog controls to digital precision. The goal was to keep the reactor safe for another 20, 40, even 60 years. In Illinois, the Byron and Dresden plants, once slated for closure, were granted new leases on life after policymakers realized how crucial they were to a carbon-neutral grid. Across the country, utilities discovered that it was often cheaper to modernize an old reactor than to build new fossil capacity. At the same time, the challenge of nuclear waste remained. In vast pools and dry casks, the spent fuel from half a century of operation waited for its final resting place. Each bundle of rods, cooled and sealed, contained decades of latent energy and an ongoing debate. The United States had long planned a deep geological repository at Yucca Mountain in Nevada, but the project had stalled amid politics and public opposition. So the waste stayed where it was, secured, monitored, and patiently awaiting consensus. To most Americans, these topics rarely surfaced in daily conversation. But inside conference rooms and research facilities, the discussion grew more urgent. If the country truly meant to decarbonize by mid-century, nuclear power, old or new, could not be ignored. Even critics admitted that intermittent renewables would need steady partners, and nuclear energy was the only zero-carbon source capable of running non-stop through the night. So the old reactors kept humming, their presence both practical and symbolic, a reminder that progress is not always about building new things, but about caring for what already endures. In their steady light, America began to rediscover not the glamour of atomic power, but its quiet usefulness, a power that asked not to be loved or feared, only understood. Far beyond the aging reactors of the present, a new vision was slowly taking shape, a rethinking of what nuclear power could be in the next half-century. In Idaho, construction began on the first small modular reactor licensed for U.S. soil, designed to generate electricity safely and efficiently for nearby communities. In Wyoming, another company prepared to convert an old coal site into a next-generation sodium-cooled reactor, a symbol of transition from the past to the future. These projects represented more than technology. They were quiet experiments in trust. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, promised to reduce the immense cost and complexity that had long haunted the industry. Built in factories and assembled on-site, they could be scaled up or down like building blocks. Their passive safety systems relied on the laws of physics rather than human reflexes. Natural convection and gravity doing the work that once required thousands of valves and sensors. Beyond fission, research into fusion continued to accelerate. The National Ignition Facility achieved a long-awaited milestone, producing more energy from a fusion reaction than the lasers used to ignite it. It was a moment decades in the making, small in scale, but vast in symbolism. Around the world, American scientists joined counterparts in France, South Korea, and the UK, each racing toward the same horizon, a future where power comes not from splitting atoms apart, but from joining them together as the stars have always done. Meanwhile, policymakers in Washington began to weave nuclear power back into the nation's climate strategy. Tax credits, loan guarantees, and advanced research funding created what some called a second renaissance. The tone was different this time, less triumphal, more pragmatic. No one spoke of electricity too cheap to meter. Instead, they spoke of reliability, resilience, and carbon-free baseload power. In this quiet reawakening, nuclear energy began to feel less like a relic of the past and more like a bridge to a sustainable future. It was not the hero of the story, but a supporting character, steadfast, mature, quietly essential. And in the soft light of that realization, America's long, complicated relationship with the atom began to feel reconciled. Not perfect, but peaceful. Not finished, but understood. As the world's attention turned toward decarbonization, America's nuclear fleet stood at a quiet intersection between legacy and necessity. Each reactor, from the humid coasts of the Carolinas to the prairies of the Midwest, carried within it half a century of lessons. They had endured oil shocks, political shifts, and waves of public fear. Yet through it all, they had done one thing consistently: deliver steady, carbon-free electricity. In the age of climate urgency, that constancy became valuable again. Energy planners began to see nuclear not as an experiment, but as infrastructure, as essential as transmission lines or water systems. The Department of Energy launched initiatives to extend the life of aging reactors, retrofit them for hydrogen production, and integrate them with renewable grids. By coupling with wind and solar, nuclear could smooth out intermittency, supplying power when the sun set and the air was still. Some reactors even found new roles beyond electricity. In Idaho and Tennessee, experimental projects began using reactor heat to produce hydrogen, a clean fuel for transportation and industry. Others explored powering desalination plants, data centers, and district heating networks. The message was clear. Nuclear energy, once isolated from the rest of the system, could now support it. Public perception, too, began to thaw. Younger generations viewed nuclear power less through the lens of fear and more through the lens of climate science. Polls showed growing support for maintaining existing plants and investing in next-generation designs. Documentaries replaced disaster footage with discussions of sustainability, and energy experts spoke of nuclear as a stabilizing force, not an alternative to renewables, but their complement. And so, the atom quietly regained a measure of dignity. It was no longer the centerpiece of American power, but it was no longer its cautionary tale either. Like the railways and dams that had defined earlier eras, it had become part of the country's deeper infrastructure, a reminder of how progress, when tended with patience, can evolve rather than vanish. Each reactor, still glowing faintly through the night, stood as a monument to endurance, a promise that even in an age obsessed with speed and novelty, there are technologies worth keeping, worth improving, and worth understanding before they are lost to time. As the 21st century moved forward, the story of nuclear power in America began to resemble the story of America itself, a narrative of ambition, reinvention, and reflection. The same nation that had once split the atom to end a war had also learned, through decades of trial and grace, how to wield that power for peace. In museums and archives, visitors could trace the arc of this transformation, the optimism of the 1950s, the protests of the 1970s, the quiet persistence of the 1990s, the revival of the 2020s. It was a cycle of faith, doubt, and rediscovery, an energy story written not only in engineering blueprints, but in public memory. By now, the atom had become less a symbol of control and more a symbol of humility. Humanity had learned that even our greatest inventions require balance, that every source of light casts a shadow. The lessons of nuclear energy extended far beyond power plants. They spoke to the fragility of systems, the importance of vigilance, and the value of restraint. Technologically, the frontier continued to expand. Research into advanced fuels and fast-spectrum reactors promised to reduce waste and extract more energy from each gram of uranium. Digital twins, computer models mirroring real reactors in real time, allowed operators to predict failures before they occurred. Robotics and drones inspected welds and cooling towers with unblinking precision. The atom's guardians had evolved. Their tools had become as quiet and precise as the energy they protected. And through it all, the public conversation matured. The old dichotomy of fear versus faith gave way to nuance. People began to understand that risk could be managed, that safety was not an absolute but a continuum, one refined through decades of experience. Nuclear power, like the grid itself, was becoming invisible again, reliable, quiet, indispensable. In that invisibility, there was a strange comfort. It meant the system was working, that somewhere, deep beneath the surface of ordinary life, controlled reactions were still unfolding, turbines still turning, electrons still flowing outward like ripples in a calm sea. The atom's story had found its rhythm again, not the booming crescendo of its youth, but the steady, enduring harmony of maturity. Every generation inherits both the dreams and the hesitations of the one before it. For America, nuclear power had been both, a symbol of its highest intelligence and its deepest caution. The atom, once split in urgency, had slowly become an emblem of endurance. And in the quiet landscape of the 21st century, its meaning was changing again. By now, energy had become more than electricity. It was data, mobility, climate, and economy, the hidden pulse of civilization. Each electron, wherever it was born, contributed to the same invisible web of life that connected people across cities and screens. Within that web, nuclear energy remained one of the few constants, a technology mature enough to be trusted and mysterious enough to still inspire wonder. In recent years, nuclear plants began exploring ways to pair directly with renewable energy. Some reactors ramped their output up and down to balance the fluctuations of wind and solar, a flexibility once thought impossible. Others provided clean heat for industrial processes or hydrogen generation, reducing emissions in sectors once considered untouchable. And the science kept advancing. Deep learning algorithms learned to predict temperature shifts within reactor cores with astonishing accuracy. Drones inspected cooling towers that once required scaffolds and crews. Startups emerged with designs for microreactors no larger than a shipping container, capable of powering small towns, islands, or remote research stations for years without refueling. The nuclear story had quietly entered a new chapter, one defined not by size, but by precision. The grand monuments of concrete had given way to subtle systems of sensors and code. Power no longer needed to be colossal to be meaningful. It only needed to be steady, safe, and shared. And in that steadiness lay a lesson. Humanity, after all, had always sought permanence, something that could outlast its mistakes. The atom, handled wisely, offered that kind of permanence, a patient light that could bridge generations, glowing softly beneath the surface of progress. In the end, perhaps the story of nuclear power was never about technology alone. It was about trust in science, in stewardship, and in ourselves. The splitting of the atom had revealed as much about human nature as it had about physics. It showed our ability to create immense power and our struggle to control it. It proved that knowledge without humility is dangerous, and humility without courage is incomplete. For decades, the nuclear debate had been framed in absolutes, safe or unsafe, good or evil, future or past. But reality lived in the quiet space between. Every advance in safety came from mistakes studied and understood. Every new design was a conversation between risk and reason. The lesson was not that nuclear power should be worshipped or feared, but that all progress requires vigilance and forgiveness. Today, as new reactors rise where old ones once stood, that lesson feels sharper than ever. Fusion scientists chase the dream of starfire contained in magnetic rings. Engineers fine-tune reactor cores to sip fuel rather than consume it. Policymakers, at last, speak of balance instead of dominance. The pursuit has become gentler, the ambition tempered with care. It's strange, and somehow fitting, that the energy humanity once used to destroy would become a cornerstone of its survival, that the atom's fire once seen as apocalyptic, might now help preserve the climate that sustains us. This, too, is the paradox of progress, that the same light which casts the deepest shadows can also illuminate the path ahead. In classrooms and control rooms, in policy offices and power plants, the story continues. The reactors hum, the data flows, and the atom endures, not as a monument to perfection, but as a quiet promise that humanity can learn, adapt, and evolve without forgetting where it began. Now, as the night deepens and the hum of the world slows, the story of nuclear power in America settles into quiet reflection. It is a story of light born from division, of danger tempered by discipline, of ambition transformed into understanding. The reactors still stand, their domes gleaming faintly under moonlight, their turbines whispering through the dark. Inside each one, a tiny universe continues its steady rhythm, atoms splitting, releasing warmth, turning water into steam, steam into motion, motion into light. The process is invisible, but its presence touches everything, from the lamp by your bedside to the distant satellite tracing a silver line across the sky. And so the atom remains, no longer feared, no longer worshipped, simply known. A teacher, a companion, a reminder that progress is not measured only by speed, but by wisdom. That true innovation does not always shout. Sometimes it hums softly beneath our feet. When we look back, perhaps we'll see that nuclear power's greatest legacy was not the energy it produced, but the perspective it gave us, that knowledge and restraint can coexist, that humanity can build and rebuild, and that even the smallest spark, when handled with care, can outshine its past. So tonight, as the turbine is turned far away and the world drifts toward sleep, imagine those quiet domes across the landscape, their faint glow rising through the dark. They are the pulse of an idea, steady, patient, eternal, a reminder that light, once born, rarely dies. It only changes form, waiting for us to understand it again. Good night.